I suppose one place to start is the fact that Alain Badiou, a 20th century philosopher, says that Rousseau is very important for politics because he's one of the first thinkers to think of society without the idea of there being some natural or divine basis for it. And it's this absence of there being any kind of natural or divine basis for society that represents any social order as being contingent, that is, not necessary as such, and therefore open to questioning and contestation. And this then perhaps leads us on to the question of democracy, because democracy also begins from a very similar recognition. It's the fact that there isn't perhaps a definite or final foundation for our societies, which gives us the freedom, as the people that live in those societies, to think about the way in which our society is organised and to question that organisation, and also to contest it and demand change as well. So what's important in terms of Rousseau's thinking is that he's opening up the social sphere to questioning, contestation and change. Well, I think it might be useful to start thinking about the question of feelings and equality from perhaps another point of view, and that is the way in which feelings can fuel inequality or relations of inequality. And to refer to another 20th century political theorist, Chantal Mouffe, she says if we look back over history, we can see how right-wing politics has been very good at mobilising people's passions in the defence of, if you want, fictional, national and communal identities. And the way in which we engage passionately with these identities often leads us to feel hatred or a sense of a desire for a violent exclusion of the other, a non-acceptance of difference, a recognition of the other as unequal. And therefore this is perhaps a challenge for left-wing politics to think of the way in which passions perhaps relate to equality. How do you mobilise people to, in fact, not engage in struggles which attempt to defend their community from others, but to engage in struggles which want to make their communities more equal and more free? And Rousseau's theory of pity perhaps gives us a starting point for thinking about this, because it's a type of identification which takes me outside myself. It takes me beyond my social position and opens me up to the suffering of those marginalised and oppressed by my society. And their suffering becomes for me a symbol at once of their inequality, but at the same time my ability to identify with their suffering suggests to me my potential to suffer in a similar way. It gives me a feeling of my shared vulnerability. And it's that shared vulnerability which provides perhaps the basis of my equality with the other, and tells me that the reason to associate with others is not because I'm like them, but sometimes because I can't be self-contained, I'm not self-sufficient myself. Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question, and Rousseau does recognise that feelings are something quite spontaneous. But he also says that the spontaneity of feelings often has to be interpreted. It has to be interpreted through reason. And the way we'll interpret our feelings often depends on the type of socialisation we've experienced. And he argues, he starts from the premise that we're all capable of feeling compassion or pity. But what can often happen is the recognition of the other's suffering is not read as an identification with them in terms of my shared vulnerability, but I recognise their suffering as a sign of, in fact, my privilege in relation to them, as a sign of, in fact, the way in which my social order places me in a position which is perhaps superior to that suffering other. So I read my absence of suffering as giving me a sense of imagined self-sufficiency. Now, for Rousseau, the fact that we can deny what that suffering implies in terms of our equality, the fact it's based on a denial of recognition, is important, Because a denial of recognition implies at some point we might have recognised the other in their suffering and recognised their equality. Because for me to feel superior, I require you to recognise me as superior. For me to feel privileged, I require you also to be in a position where I recognise you as dispossessed. So there's this mutual recognition that occurs, and that mutual recognition perhaps implies a fundamental equality, the fact that I'm not, again, self-contained or self-sufficient. And so Rousseau would say that we need to think about the ways in which we're socialised in our political context to get us to think through the kinds of responses we have to suffering, to make us see that suffering as a call, if you want, to aid the other, because I'm not self-sufficient, that person's not self-sufficient, and that should provide the basis of our association. Rousseau deals with this question too, because he says that pity shouldn't be treated as a pure feeling, shouldn't be treated as an end in itself. And he talks about this in relation to theatre audiences, and in particular refers to the way in which tyrannical Roman emperors would go and weep at fictional evils presented on stage, but would allow atrocities to be committed, or would commit the atrocities on a daily basis. And he argues that for pity to become something that has the potential to motivate us into action, it has to produce anxiety in us. It has to produce anxiety for our identity and our position in the social order, and make us question who we are and what we are, and whether our identifications, whether our preconceptions, place us among those that allow exploitation, oppression to continue. So he argues that pity, in order for it to be something that leads to political action, it requires this sense of anxiety in us. But this sense of anxiety in us makes us question our social position, makes us question our relationship to others, and then should also at the same time make us think about this kind of society we live in, and do I, as a member of that society, that belongs to that society, and who, for Rousseau, as a citizen of that society, I'm responsible, along with others, for ensuring its legitimacy, do I not feel in some way that I should be contesting this situation, be moved to political action, to demand equality in a system that's based on inequality? Well, again, what Rousseau would argue there is that the fact that you're saying, I can't feel that, is a recognition of the possibility again. So we're back to this idea that my denial of others and my denial of their suffering rests at some point on a recognition of them, because I can only deny them if at some moment I've acknowledged them. So it's all about trying to reactivate that acknowledgement of others and think about not just about our responses in terms of what we feel, but what those responses demand of us as citizens of democratic communities who are in fact responsible for ensuring the legitimacy of that community. Well, I think what it tells us is that taking up the challenge of democratic citizenship often involves not identification with the consensus that our society has reached, the kind of agreements that we've reached, but often thinking about what those consensus or those agreements exclude. The way how we represent the common to ourselves, how does that in some ways perhaps support relations of inequality, exclude others? So it's about looking beyond perhaps institutions and the way in which they manage us as individuals within society, and beginning to think about perhaps the incompleteness of our society which those who are excluded and those who are oppressed represent to us. And it's that incompleteness which perhaps acts as a call for us to think about the ways in which our society could be improved through a collective effort. And this is what's important for Rousseau. It's the fact that that no community is ever self-sufficient, and because it's not self-sufficient, it always requires the activities of the citizens that live there. And the citizens always have to be willing to revitalise their communal ties in the face of their possible betrayal, in the face of a recognition of the failure of their society to live up to its promises of freedom and equality, But that failure should be taken on board with by us, should be a call to responsibility and to respond to it and think of ways we can overcome it.